In late 1941, during the crisis outside Moscow, Adolf Hitler issued an order that would define German military operations for the rest of the war. German forces would hold their positions and not retreat under any circumstances. Professional military officers immediately recognized this as tactically and strategically dangerous. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized elastic defense, trading space for time, conducting tactical withdrawals to avoid encirclement, preserving combat power rather than defending untenable positions. Field commanders requested authorization for tactical retreats to establish defensible lines before Soviet winter offensives overran forward positions. Hitler refused every request. He insisted that retreating was psychologically devastating and that willpower could overcome tactical disadvantages. That decision, to prohibit retreats regardless of tactical necessity, became permanent policy that German commanders would face for the remainder of the war, watching their forces destroyed in place when withdrawal could have saved them. The December 1941 Soviet counteroffensive outside Moscow pushed German forces back in desperate fighting. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. German units lacked winter equipment. Soviet forces attacked exhausted German positions. In this crisis, Hitler's standfast order arguably prevented complete collapse. Units that held positions maintained some organization. The alternative, retreat in winter conditions with pursuing enemy, might have caused disintegration. German forces stabilized a line east of their starting positions. They survived the winter despite catastrophic conditions. To Hitler, this proved his point. He believed that prohibiting retreat had saved the army when professional military judgment would have led to disaster. He drew a lesson that would shape every subsequent decision: willpower and refusal to retreat overcome tactical disadvantages. Professional military officers drew a different lesson. They had survived despite the standfast order through enormous casualties and destruction of combat power, not because of it. Hitler interpreted Moscow's survival as validation that refusing retreat always works. This was catastrophically wrong. Moscow's situation had specific characteristics. The retreat would have occurred in winter. German logistics had collapsed anyway, making organized withdrawal difficult, and Soviet forces were also exhausted, limiting exploitation. The standfast order in these specific circumstances may have been less damaging than alternatives. Hitler universalized this into absolute principle: German forces never retreat. Professional military officers understood that Moscow was exception, not rule. In most situations, tactical withdrawal preserves combat power, avoids encirclement, and establishes better defensive positions. Doctrine developed over centuries emphasized that defending everywhere means being strong nowhere. Refusing tactical retreats meant forces would be overextended and vulnerable. But Hitler had his proof that professional military judgment was defeatist and that willpower overcame circumstances. After Moscow, requests for tactical withdrawals were not just denied, they were treated as evidence of weak leadership. By mid-1942, Hitler's no-retreat policy had become formal operational doctrine. Field commanders were explicitly prohibited from conducting tactical withdrawals without Hitler's personal authorization. Requests for such authorization were rarely granted and frequently led to commanders being relieved. The policy was enforced through command structure. Officers who retreated without authorization faced court-martial. Professional military culture that emphasized preserving combat power through elastic defense was overridden by political command that treated any retreat as moral failure. German military academies taught tactical withdrawal as fundamental skill. Officers were now prohibited from applying what their training said was necessary. Wehrmacht doctrine manuals described when and how to conduct retreats. Those manuals were effectively worthless because political authority had forbidden retreats regardless of tactical situation. The institutional knowledge about defensive warfare that Germany possessed was made inaccessible by policy that prohibited its application. German military professionals understood exactly what no retreat policy would cause. Elastic defense was not cowardice, it was how outnumbered or outgunned forces survived. Trading space for time allowed forces to fall back to prepared positions. Tactical withdrawals shortened supply lines while extending enemy logistics. Avoiding encirclement preserved combat power for counterattacks. Every professional military principle said that refusing tactical retreats would lead to forces being surrounded and destroyed. Officers trained in these principles found themselves prohibited from applying them. When battlefield conditions clearly indicated that withdrawal was tactically necessary, they had to request permission that usually came too late or not at all. The result was predictable: German units stayed in exposed positions until enemy offensives encircled them. Combat power that could have been saved through timely withdrawal was destroyed defending positions that had no strategic value. Professional military judgment was systematically overridden by political command that treated retreat as ideological failure rather than tactical necessity. The first major failures of no-retreat policy came in 1942 on the Eastern Front. German units defending exposed positions requested authorization to withdraw to better defensive lines. Authorization was denied. Soviet offensives encircled the units that could have retreated. The encircled forces were destroyed or captured. This happened repeatedly. Each time, field commanders requested retreat authorization while withdrawal was still possible. Each time, authorization was denied or came too late. Each time, forces were encircled that could have been saved. After each disaster, professional military staff presented analysis showing that timely withdrawal would have preserved combat power. The analysis was dismissed. Hitler argued that the encircled units held enemy forces that would otherwise threaten elsewhere. This was backwards logic. Losing entire units to hold positions briefly was catastrophically inefficient compared to conducting withdrawal that preserved combat power for defense elsewhere. But the pattern was established: no retreat would be maintained regardless of tactical consequences. Hitler's refusal to allow retreats was not primarily military judgment, it was ideological conviction. In Nazi ideology, retreat represented weakness and failure of will. Germans were racially superior and therefore should never give ground to inferior enemies. Territorial gains represented conquest that validated the regime. Retreating from conquered territory admitted that conquest could be reversed. Hitler personally associated retreat with the 1918 German collapse, which he blamed on psychological failure rather than military defeat. He believed that preventing psychological collapse required prohibiting physical retreat. This ideological framework made rational tactical assessment impossible. When officers argued that tactical withdrawal preserved combat power, Hitler heard defeatism. When they explained that elastic defense was professional military doctrine, he interpreted this as excuse for weakness. The ideology that shaped Hitler's understanding of warfare made it impossible for him to accept that sometimes retreating was the militarily correct decision. Combat effectiveness was subordinated to ideological certainty that retreat was always wrong. Stalingrad established the pattern most clearly. When Soviet forces encircled the Sixth Army in November 1942, professional military consensus was unanimous: break out immediately while encirclement is weak. Hitler prohibited breakout. The army was ordered to hold position. The result was total destruction of Germany's most powerful field army. Professional officers assumed this catastrophe would force policy change. It did not. Hitler blamed the Sixth Army's destruction on insufficient will and on Paulus's decision to eventually surrender rather than die in place. The lesson Hitler drew from Stalingrad was that future encirclements should fight harder, not that forces should be allowed to withdraw before encirclement occurred. After Stalingrad, the no-retreat policy became even more rigid. Every subsequent encirclement followed the same pattern: forces were ordered to hold until destroyed. Field commanders requesting withdrawal authorization were denied. Combat power was systematically destroyed defending positions that professional judgment said should be abandoned. The cumulative cost of no-retreat policy was staggering. German forces that could have been preserved through tactical withdrawals were destroyed holding untenable positions. Each destroyed division was combat power that Germany could not replace and desperately needed elsewhere. Professional military calculations showed that conducting timely withdrawals would have saved perhaps 30 to 40% of forces that were actually lost. Those saved divisions would have been available for defense at critical points. Instead, they were destroyed piecemeal defending positions that professional judgment said were indefensible. The mathematics were brutal: German forces were outnumbered on most fronts. The only way to defend effectively was through mobile defense that preserved forces. Prohibiting withdrawal meant forces could not move to threatened sectors because they were tied to fixed positions. German strength was dispersed defending everywhere, which meant being strong nowhere. Combat power bled away holding positions rather than being concentrated for defense or counterattack. In early 1944, German forces in the Korsun salient faced obvious encirclement threat. Field commanders requested authorization to withdraw while roads were still open. Hitler prohibited retreat. Soviet forces completed encirclement. German forces attempted breakout only after encirclement was complete and highly costly. Thousands were killed or captured who could have withdrawn safely days earlier. Professional military staff presented this as textbook example of how no-retreat policy destroyed forces unnecessarily. The analysis was ignored. Korsun was simply Stalingrad on smaller scale: forces ordered to hold exposed positions despite encirclement threat, withdrawal prohibited until too late, breakout attempted only when extremely costly, combat power destroyed that timely retreat would have saved. The pattern was so consistent that officers could predict exactly what would happen. They could identify encirclement threats days before they materialized. They could calculate when withdrawal needed to occur to be safe. They were prohibited from acting on professional assessment because political authority had forbidden retreat. Field commanders who retreated without authorization, even when their tactical judgment was obviously correct, were relieved of command. The most capable German field commanders learned that preserving their forces through unauthorized withdrawal would end their careers. This created perverse incentive. Commanders could maintain their positions by following orders that destroyed their units, or they could save their units through withdrawal and lose their commands. Professional military culture should reward commanders who preserve combat power through sound tactical judgment. Hitler's policy punished such commanders and rewarded those who followed destructive orders. The result was that German field leadership was selected for obedience rather than tactical competence. Officers who questioned no-retreat policy were replaced by officers who enforced it regardless of consequences. By 1944, German field command was systematically biased toward commanders who would not withdraw even when withdrawal was obviously necessary. Institutional learning that should have occurred recognizing that no retreat was destroying forces unnecessarily could not occur because the system punished officers who acted on that recognition. In 1944–45, Germany's strategic position required trading space for time, exactly what no-retreat policy prevented. Conducting systematic withdrawals to defensible lines, preserving forces, and shortening supply lines might have prolonged defense by months. Instead, forces remained in exposed positions until overrun. The collapse on all fronts accelerated because German units could not withdraw to better positions. They fought where they stood until destroyed, then the next position faced similar fate. Professional military assessment was that Germany was going to lose regardless, the question was how long defense could be maintained. No-retreat policy ensured that defense collapsed as quickly as possible by preventing the mobile defense that might have delayed Allied advances. In the war's final months, German forces remained in surrounded positions rather than withdrawing to form new defensive lines. Hitler ordered cities defended to destruction rather than evacuated. The policy that supposedly demonstrated will and strength actually ensured the most rapid and complete military collapse possible. Forces trapped in pockets by no-retreat policy consumed enormous resources in futile relief attempts. Stalingrad relief operations diverted forces desperately needed elsewhere. Similar relief efforts for other encirclements consumed combat power that could have been used for defense. The trapped units themselves were useless, they could not maneuver, could not support other operations, and eventually were destroyed anyway. If those units had been allowed to withdraw, they would have remained effective combat forces available for defense. Instead, they were written off as holding enemy forces in their pockets. This was catastrophic resource allocation. The forces consumed in relief attempts plus the forces destroyed in pockets represented combat power that properly mobile defense would have preserved. Professional military planning tried to account for these resource sinks, but policy made planning impossible. Commanders could not predict which units would be trapped next because that depended on whether Hitler would authorize withdrawal. Professional military institutions eventually documented the no-retreat policy's destructive effects. Staff analyses calculated forces lost that could have been saved. They compared outcomes of situations where withdrawal was permitted versus prohibited. The evidence was overwhelming. No-retreat policy destroyed German combat power unnecessarily without achieving compensating benefits. These assessments were presented through military channels. They documented specific examples, projected alternative outcomes, and recommended policy revision. The recommendations were ignored or rejected. Hitler's ideological commitment to no retreat overrode empirical evidence that the policy was catastrophic. The institutional learning that should have occurred recognizing failed policy and adapting could not occur because ideology prevented accepting what evidence showed. By late war, professional military staff stopped presenting analyses criticizing no retreat because such analyses were treated as defeatism rather than as professional assessment. The feedback mechanisms that allow military institutions to learn from mistakes were broken by political authority that refused to acknowledge mistakes. Military historians analyzing Germany's defensive operations consistently identify no-retreat policy as magnifying combat power losses enormously. If German commanders had been permitted to conduct tactical withdrawals when professional judgment indicated necessity, several probable outcomes emerge. Forces would have avoided encirclement that led to total loss. Defensive lines would have been more resilient because forces could fall back to prepared positions. German combat power would have been preserved longer, allowing more effective defense, and the final collapse would have been delayed by months. This is not speculation about Germany winning, it is recognition that professional military doctrine exists because it preserves forces better than politically driven alternatives. Germany was going to lose, but how long and how effectively Germany could defend depended on whether forces were used efficiently. No-retreat policy ensured forces were used most inefficiently possible. Combat power was destroyed holding untenable positions rather than being preserved through withdrawal for defense elsewhere. The cost was measured in divisions destroyed unnecessarily and months of defense that never occurred because the forces to conduct it had been wasted. Germany's no-retreat policy exemplifies what happens when political leadership overrides professional military judgment on tactical matters. Professional military doctrine develops over centuries because certain principles work. Elastic defense preserves combat power. Trading space for time allows outnumbered forces to survive. Tactical withdrawals are not moral failures, they are necessary military operations. When political authority prohibits tactically sound operations because of ideological commitments, forces get destroyed unnecessarily. This pattern appears throughout military history. Politically driven tactical directives that override professional judgment consistently lead to disaster. German forces in World War II were led by tactically competent officers working within professional military tradition. That competence was neutralized by political authority that prohibited applying professional judgment. The no-retreat policy was not unique to Hitler. Similar politically driven tactical restrictions appear in other conflicts. The lesson is consistent. When ideology or political considerations override professional military assessment of tactical necessity, combat effectiveness suffers catastrophically. When Germany surrendered, professional military analysis documented the cost of Hitler's no-retreat policy. Dozens of divisions were destroyed in encirclements that could have been avoided through timely withdrawal. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured holding positions that professional judgment said should be abandoned. The combat power lost through no-retreat policy was exactly what Germany needed for effective defense in the war's final years. Professional officers had predicted this. They had recommended policy change. They had presented evidence that the policy was destroying forces unnecessarily. Every recommendation was rejected. Hitler maintained no-retreat policy until the end, blaming failures on insufficient will rather than on the policy itself. German military institutions had developed professional doctrine over centuries. That doctrine emphasized preserving combat power through elastic defense. Political authority prohibited applying the doctrine. The result was that German forces fought under constraints that made defeat faster and more complete than necessary. The tactical competence that German officers possessed could not be applied because political leadership had forbidden the tactical operations that competence said were necessary. Germany did not lose because professional military judgment was wrong. Germany lost partly because professional military judgment was systematically prevented from being applied.